stay in power. We all know this. That's what happened. We can't forget it. It was Donald Trump's big lie that soaked our political landscape in kerosene. It was Donald Trump's rally on the Mall that struck the match. And then came the fire. And pouring gasoline on that fire are many, in one branch of our media, who spread the big lie then and continue to spread the big lie, even though they know it's false. And millions listen to these people and believe it. Here, too, is another terrible truth. The disease of the big lie continues to this day. The attacks on our democracy are ongoing. If not by the force of baseball bats and pipe bombs, then certainly through a quieter and much more organized effort to subvert democracy from the bottom up. Just as the big lie inspired the attack of January 6th, the big lie continues like a disease across state legislatures throughout the country, where we're seeing the most restrictive voter suppression efforts since Jim Crow in 21st century America, turning the clock way back. Let's be abundantly clear. These new anti-voter laws are on the books today only because their authors cited the big lie, cited the fictitious bugaboo of voter fraud, and are trying to succeed where the insurrection failed. Unless we confront the big lie, unless we all do our part to fortify and strengthen our democracy, the political violence of January 6th risks becoming not an aberration, but, God forbid, the norm. And we've seen it, too, in the threats against election workers, teachers, school administrators, healthcare workers. We cannot put our heads in the sand. We cannot brush this over. And what does that mean for the Senate? I think we have to talk about the realities here today, too. It means we must pass legislation, effective legislation, to defend our democracy, to protect the right to vote. We must pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act so that our country's destiny is determined by the voice of the people and not by the violent whims of lies and even mob rule. We must also guard against the false hopes of solutions that don't deal with the problem, that try to cover it up or push it away because people don't want to deal with it. Some say the answer lies in doing the bare minimum, like reforming the Electoral Count Act that my friend, the Republican leader, has floated in recent days. Let me take this opportunity to make clear that that plan, the McConnell plan, that's what it is unacceptable, unacceptably insufficient, and even offensive. Some scorekeeping matters little if the game is rigged. And as we know too well, state legislatures are working day and night to undermine our democratic process from the get-go by empowering partisans to potentially say which ballots count and which do not. What good is it to accurately count a result that's compromised from the start? Senator McConnell's plan to reform the Electoral Count Act would do nothing more than codify the Vice President's ceremonial role in counting of the Electoral College votes, effectively guaranteeing that partisan state legislatures could overturn the elections without fear of recourse. Look at what it does. Look at what it does. It's a cynical idea. It's an idea to divert attention from the real issue because they don't want to confront the real issue. This should not be about one party versus another. Voting rights has always been bipartisan, supported by Bush, HW&W, supported by Reagan, passing this chamber with large votes from both sides of the aisle. That's what always used to happen until the Republican Party was taken over by Donald Trump. So, it's not about one party versus another. It can't be. It's about one terrible lie against democracy itself, the kind of lie that, if let stand, both verbally and in action, erodes our democracy. Erodes our democracy. If a majority of people, there's already a substantial minority who don't believe our elections are legitimate, aided and egged on by Donald Trump and the right-wing media. What if a majority of this country, because of these pernicious actions, start believing it? A majority of Americans don't believe that elections are on the level? Just ask yourself, what will happen? I can't predict the details, but I can predict that it will diminish the greatness of this country in small and even large ways. So we cannot, this should not be a partisan issue. It's about falsehood versus truth. In the history of this country, we have always disagreed on ideology, but never on facts, until recently, and in such an important area. If lying about results of an election is acceptable, if instigating a mob against the government is considered permissible, if encouraging political violence becomes the norm, it will be open season on this grand democracy, this noble experiment, and everything will be up for grabs by whoever has the biggest clubs, the sharpest spears.
Huge support. What we all witnessed.
It's not. And he's still doubled down on the big lie, and the result of that is, as my colleagues have said here today, there are more than 400 bills nationwide in the name of that big lie, making it harder for the American people to vote, making it harder for them to register, making it harder for people to vote early or to vote by mail because of a myth, because of a lie, slashing the number of polling places and drop boxes. In Texas, they are down to 1 drop box per county. In Colorado, I can practically cross my street and vote at a drop box. This is an effort to subvert elections to cling to power. That is what is happening here. It is based on a massive falsehood, the big lie. I think one needs to ask oneself, even people that support President Trump, what future does the Stop the Steal movement imagine for our country? What future do they imagine for this democracy where every election is going to be contested, where political violence replaces the ballot box, where elections are decided by strongmen, not votes, turning us into Russia or China? Is that really what we want our legacy to be here in the country? Do we want to be the first generation of Americans to decide that it's just too hard to do our duty to the people that founded this country, the people that fought from the time this country was founded until today, who died for the sake of democracy, that it's just too hard, that somehow our differences are unique or so important that we're going to give up on our shared commitment to the democracy in favor of those disagreements? I think we need to ask ourselves at a moment like this what we owe the generations of Americans that have fought to make this country more democratic, more fair, and more free. What do we owe the 158 million Americans, a record, who showed up during a plague, this COVID pandemic, to cast their votes for Donald Trump and for Joe Biden? What are they owed? And what do we owe our kids and our grandkids? I think the answer is very clear, which is a stronger democracy and economy that works for everybody, not just the people at the very top. And where do we begin? You know, Colorado, I think, is a great example, Mr. President, where we have made it a lot easier for people to vote. We have one of the highest voter turnouts in the country. I always have to say, especially when the senator from Minnesota is around, that we are number 2 in terms of voter turnout. Minnesota is number 1, but we're coming for you. And that's the spirit we should all have. We should be trying to get more people to vote, not fewer people to vote. We should have vote by mail. We should have early balloting. We have all of that in Colorado. One of the highest turnout rates in the country, and no fraud. No fraud. So I'm going to just finish by saying that we should distrust politicians who can't seem to win people's votes with their argument, just as we should distrust politicians who attack the free press to avoid accountability, even though that free press is enshrined in our Constitution. And we should recommit to each other and the democracy. Let me tell you something, Mr. President. Last week, we had another tragedy in Colorado, another disaster. Pueblo, Colorado, or Boulder, Colorado started out this year with a mass shooting in a grocery store. Some of you may remember that. And basically on New Year's Eve, we had a massive fire that ripped through neighborhoods in the Front Range of Colorado and Boulder County. 1,000 people, 1,000 houses were burned. More than 30,000 people lost their homes. And I sat there thinking to myself as I was with my daughters watching those fires on the television set, how much we actually need each other, you know? And there's a lot of evidence out there in those 2 days that the law enforcement that got those 30,000 people out and had almost literally no fatalities because of what they did and what they sacrificed. The Coloradans that stepped up that night and said, you can come to my house. We'll put you up in my house, so that out of those 30,000 people, there were fewer than 300 people in a shelter that night. The reporters, the journalists that were out there long into the night reporting on that fire so that people might have some sense of whether their house had been lost or their house had been saved. The local county officials who have worked tirelessly after flood and after fires, after natural disasters, to come together to make sure that we build back stronger, which we always do in Colorado. And even, let me say, the federal government's contribution, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, because if there is one reason that we should be one nation under God, it's for a natural disaster like the one that's just occurred in Colorado. This is our choice. We either save this democracy, which I believe we will, or we let it go. And it's going to be on us. And if we let it go, generations of Americans are going to indict us for that. And if we save it, I think they'll celebrate the work that we did here, just as we celebrate the work of the people that came before us, that made our country more democratic, more fair, and more free. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Maryland.
I want to thank my colleague from Colorado for reminding us of how important it is for us to come together as Americans to protect our communities and to protect our country, and that's really why we're all here today on the floor of the Senate. Because 1 year ago today, we witnessed a violent attack on this Capitol and on our democracy itself. It was not a sneak attack by a foreign power like Pearl Harbor. It was not an attack by a foreign terrorist group like 9/11. It was an attack from within. And it was orchestrated and instigated by the former President of the United States. 1 year later, while we have improved the physical security of this Capitol, we have not secured our democracy. Our great American experiment remains under as much threat today as it did a year ago. And we as Americans have a duty to come together to take action to protect it. The violent mob unleashed by Donald Trump a year ago stormed and sacked this Capitol. Insurrectionists scaled the ramparts, tore through the barricades, and breached this building. They used flagpoles to beat Officer Michael Fanone and used chemical spray to assault Officer Brian Sicknick, who tragically died the next day. A gallows was built outside of this Capitol while rioters chanted, quote, "Hang Mike Pence." Like many others, I recall flags and banners of far-right extremist groups were paraded through these halls. This citadel of our democracy was violently attacked. The Capitol Hill community was traumatized, and so was the country. But in that dark hour, when our democracy was under attack, members of the U.S. Capitol Police, of the National Guard, and the D.C. Metropolitan Police stepped up and answered the call. There were many stories of bravery from that day, but I want to draw attention to Officer Eugene Goodman, a Marylander who protected our democracy by diverting the mob away from this Senate chamber. His actions on January 6th saved lives, and Maryland is proud to call him one of our own. It's because of the courage of Officer Goodman, his fellow officers, and many other heroes that the mob was ultimately forced to retreat, and the Senate and the House were able to reconvene to finish the certification of the electoral count. Mr. President, that was the job that we had all come here to do on January 6, 2021. And that was the job that the rioters had tried to stop. They were driven to violence by Donald Trump's big lie that the 2020 election was stolen, and they were hell-bent on answering his call to overturn the results of that election and overturn the will of the American people. They failed in that effort. On that day, all of us were determined not to leave this place until we got the job done and certified the vote, and that's what we did. And when we returned to the Senate floor after the attack on our Capitol, I really believed for those few hours that most members of this Senate appreciated the gravity of the moment we had just lived through. I had real hope that all of us, regardless of party or politics, felt the weight of history upon us. I had hoped that most of us grasped the idea that the machinery of our democracy does not operate automatically. It is not self-executing. That institutions are ultimately only as strong as the people who safeguard them. That is up to each and every one of us to nurture and protect our democracy. That we are the current stewards of our republic's tradition of the peaceful transfer of power. Mr. President, I really believe that night that that was a shared belief in this Senate. In my remarks when we returned that evening, I described the attack as a wake-up call to the country, for all of us as Americans. That day showed us exactly what can happen when we fail to come together, not as Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans, to stand up for the truth, to stand up for our democracy, and to stand up against lies that undermine public confidence and faith in our elections. That day showed us in a violent and undeniable way that if we allowed the poison of the big lie to continue to spread, our democracy would continue to be under threat. I hope we would heed the warning of that horrible day. And I was pleased to work with colleagues here, including the senator from Minnesota and others, to help fortify the physical security of our Capitol building. We have delivered additional resources to the Capitol Police. We selected a new Sergeant of Arms and a new Chief of the Capitol Police. And we are continuing to implement the other key recommendations that have been made to strengthen the security of Capitol Hill. But Mr. President, while we are improving the physical security here on Capitol Hill, we are failing in our larger duty to the American people. We have failed to stop the spread of the big lie and its corrosive impact on the confidence in our democracy. We know that Joe Biden beat Donald Trump in a free and fair election, and yet too many of our Republican colleagues put political convenience ahead of country and ahead of our Constitution. Too many are afraid to state the facts and tell the American people the simple truth. And because of that fundamental failure, the big lie has metastasized and represents a clear and present danger to the democratic process throughout the country. When the violent mob failed to overturn the election results in this chamber a year ago today, the big lie did not end. It materialized in other forms to undermine our democracy. As we speak, Republican-controlled state legislatures, fueled by the big lie, are passing laws making it harder for people to vote, especially people of color, people with disabilities, and younger voters. In addition to putting up barriers to voting, proponents of the big lie are stripping power from election officials who dared to challenge Donald Trump's plot to falsely claim victory in the 2020 election. The Georgia General Assembly removed Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger as head of the state election board after he denied Trump's request to, quote, find 1,780 votes, unquote, the exact number he needed to defeat Joe Biden in Georgia. It was not enough that Raffensperger, a loyal Republican, had voted for Donald Trump. His offense was failure to implement the big lie. In Michigan, Republicans are moving to saturate election boards with big lie loyalists in an effort to control the counting of ballots. And across the country, other laws are being passed at the state level that would authorize partisan officials to change or overturn the results of elections even after votes have been cast and counted. Mr. President, what we are witnessing is an all-out continuing assault on our democracy. And the longer we wait, the more the threat grows. The clock is ticking. Now is the time to act. That's why we must establish uniform national standards to protect access to the ballot box and ensure that our elections reflect the will of the American people, not the political wishes of any party or any one person. That is exactly what the Freedom to Vote Act does and why we must pass it. This bill would defend every American's right to the ballot. The Freedom to Vote Act also helps protect election officials from unfair removal and guards against attempts to tamper with or change election results. In addition, the bill contains provisions to keep our elections fair and honest, including crucial campaign finance reform and a ban on partisan gerrymandering. And the enactment of the Freedom to Vote Act should go hand in hand with the passage of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to restore the full protections guaranteed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Mr. President, while I had hoped that action to preserve our democracy would be a bipartisan endeavor, it's clear that our Senate Republican colleagues are not willing to join us in passing these bills. Efforts to strike a compromise have been met with virtually zero support on the other side of the aisle. Democrats are willing to move forward ourselves to protect our democracy, but our Republican colleagues have weaponized the current filibuster rule and are using it to thwart progress. They've even blocked our attempt to have a debate on voting rights when we raised the issue 6 months ago. Mr. President, those actions are undermining the very spirit, the tradition, and function of this Senate. The Senate was designed to promote vigorous and long debate while also respecting the ultimate will of a majority of senators and a majority of the American people. Today we see the opposite. very little real debate on the Senate floor, and the denial of a majority vote to resolve the big questions of the day, resulting in the denial of the will of the American people. We can change that. We have to change that. We can change it by adapting the current rules of the Senate to restore the original intent of the framers. We must do that for the health of our institutions and the good of our democracy. Mr. President, James McHenry, Maryland's delegate to the Constitutional Convention, wrote in his diaries about a famous exchange between Elizabeth Willing Powell and Benjamin Franklin. He wrote, I quote, "A lady asked Dr. Franklin, 'Well, doctor, what have we? What have we got? A monarchy or a republic?' 'A republic,' replied the doctor, 'if you can keep it.'" A year ago today on this floor, I quoted this exact exchange. And now, on the one-year anniversary of January 6th, we are still met with the same question and same test of whether or not we can muster the will to do what must be done to keep our republic. There's still time. We can still repair and sustain our democracy. 1 year ago, we did not allow a violent mob to prevent us from staying right here to do our job. We completed the certification of the presidential election. But our job is not over. We have not finished the job of securing our democracy. Mr. President, now is the time for us to do that. Let's come together and do what's necessary and right for our republic, for our democracy, and for the American people. And I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator for Virginia.
Mr. President, I'm so happy to join my colleagues on the floor in a very solemn effort to think through the meaning at a one-year anniversary of the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Today is not only that anniversary. Today in the Christian tradition is the Feast of the Epiphany. And I remembered sitting in the chamber last year as we were barricaded in under attack, and with the confusion all around me, at one point I realized today's the Feast of the Epiphany. The Feast of the Epiphany, January 6th. What is Epiphany? The Feast of the Epiphany celebrates the arrival of the Magi at the manger. Wise men of the day saw a portent and disturbance in the sky and were led to a place where they believed something remarkable would happen. What they found completely surprised them. It wasn't what they were expecting. It wasn't power. It wasn't pomp. It wasn't majesty. It was a tiny baby born to a family too humble to even get a room at an inn, lying with his mother in a stable surrounded by barnyard animals. They found something that they couldn't have imagined, and it changed their lives and it changed the world. Why do I reference the Feast of the Epiphany? I reference it because, like many things in the Christian story, it's gone way beyond Christianity. By the middle 17 or 1800s, the word epiphany now had a broader use. It was not just about the arrival of the Magi at the manger. The word epiphany now means something much more widespread in the English language. It is defined as a moment in which you suddenly see something in a new or very clear way. The word epiphany comes from a Greek root meaning reveal. All of us, no matter how long we've been around, have the capacity for epiphanies, deeper understandings of essential truths that reveal themselves in our lives. I want to talk about January 6th and one epiphany I've had as a result of it. Before I do, I want to acknowledge 5 people, 5 Virginia law enforcement officers who lost their lives in the days after the Capitol attack. I thank my colleague, Senator Warner, who talked at really important length about the contributions of the Virginia State Police and the Virginia National Guard. I want to focus on 5 people. Brian Sicknick, U.S. Capitol Police, 42-year-old, after service in the military, had been with the Capitol Police for 13 years, died immediately after the attack because of injuries he received that day. Jeffrey Smith, another Virginian, 35 years old, 12-year patrolman with the Metropolitan Police Department, died after the attack by suicide. Howie Liebengood, 51 years old, a 15-year veteran of the U.S. Capitol Police, died shortly after the attack by suicide. Kyle DeFreetag, 26-year-old, 5-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police Department, died a few days after the attack by suicide. Gunther Hashida, 43 years old, an 18-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police Department, died in the days after the attack by suicide. All Virginians. I'm haunted by these deaths, and I will say I am particularly haunted by those who died by suicide, whose families are now fighting to get line of duty benefits for their deaths. All of us in our lives have been affected by suicide in families and friends. And suicide is complicated. There's not a single thing as you dig into a suicide. But I just use the insights I've gained as a member of the Armed Services Committee together with you, Mr. President. Over the time we've been here, there's been a slight shift in understanding of causes of suicide within the military. The conventional wisdom about it when I came here was that suicide was driven maybe as a principal factor in the military and among veterans because of the cumulative effects of trauma. The trauma was so significant that that led to suicide. And of course, trauma is a key factor, but more recent understanding of suicide suggests that an even more important factor may not be trauma, but a sense of abandonment. I was in a military unit. I had a lot of people around me. They had my back. We were close. We were connected. We were really tight. And then I moved into a civilian world where I didn't have that connection. And people didn't have my back. And I was lost, and I didn't know who to turn to or who would look out for me. I'm haunted by the deaths of these 4 Virginians to suicide because I wonder if they felt abandoned. Did they feel abandoned by us? They were fighting that day to save our democracy, to save this Capitol, and to save their lives, and yet 147 of the 535 members of Congress voted with the mob to overturn the election, to throw out the democracy, to do the bidding of a would-be authoritarian. If you are fighting to protect these 535 members of Congress in this institution and you watch nearly 30% of the members side with the attackers, I would suggest that they might have felt abandoned. When I was here on January 6th, I experienced a lot of emotions, and I'm just going to describe 2: relief and anger. Relief. How could that day create a sense of relief? I was relieved that I had told my staff to stay home. My chief of staff disobeyed me. But I was relieved that I had told my staff to stay home. Thank God they were safe. I was relieved to look right here and see no pages. I was relieved that pages were not here in this chamber because thank God they would be safe. And I was relieved not only because my staff was safe, I was relieved because I didn't want their youthful, altruistic, public service motivation to be damaged or demoralized by what was happening that day. I expressed this to my staff this morning. I sent a note to them and I said, in the middle of all these emotions, I was relieved that you weren't here, that I told you to stay home so you wouldn't be in danger like so many were. But I don't want you to be demoralized by what happened. And I had a staff member come to me right before I came to the floor and said, January 6th didn't demoralize me, it energized me. Thank God for that. The second emotion that was so powerful in me, and even so powerful that I couldn't quite understand it, was anger. Now, of course, anger would be an acceptable and completely understandable reaction to what was going on. And I've known anger in my life, but the anger I felt that day was different than I felt in 63 years. There was something different about it. And it took me months to figure it out. Was it just the physical attack? Was it that friends and staff and other people were in danger? Yeah, that was all part of it. It took me months to figure out exactly why I was so angry. And then I had an epiphany. No one in my life had ever tried to disenfranchise me. I'm a white male born in 1958. I'm a civil rights lawyer in the capital of the Confederacy, fighting for voting rights for all kinds of people. Of course, voting rights were important. I was passionately committed to it in my professional life before I came here. But it was something that I was sort of, trying to do to help others. No one had ever tried to disenfranchise me. But what was going on the floor that day was an effort to object to the very first state, as you went through them alphabetically, that had voted for Joe Biden, to object to that state and try to disenfranchise through that objections and others that were lined up the 80 million people who had voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. All of us who cast our ballots that way, we were being disenfranchised that day. It had never happened to me before. For some Americans, they've experienced disenfranchisement often in their lives. Some Americans have experienced disenfranchisement during their whole lives. Some Americans have experienced disenfranchisement not for 4 hours, but for 4 centuries. It had never happened to me. For a few hours, and just a few, I felt the pain of those who have faced disenfranchisement efforts to take away or threaten their vote for their whole lives. And I hated that feeling. My epiphany was one of empathy. So this is how it feels when others scheme to take your vote, when they try to exclude you, when they try to say you don't count. This is how it feels. It hadn't happened to me before, and for a few hours, it did. The next morning, I walked into the Capitol, and the sun was shining, and the threat to me was past. We had finished the work. The insurrection delayed the certification and peaceful transfer of power, but it couldn't stop it. But the epiphany of briefly being in the shoes of those who have been disenfranchised throughout their lives has changed me profoundly. It hadn't changed my personality, it hadn't changed my relationships, but it's changed my priorities. Again, I was a civil rights lawyer doing voting rights work in the capital of the Confederacy. Protecting the right to vote has always been important to me. Protecting the integrity of campaigns and elections have always been important to me. But now it's beyond that. It's not just an important priority. It is an existential necessity that we respond to the mass disenfranchisement effort of January 6th with guaranteeing the franchise, guaranteeing people's right to vote, guaranteeing that when they vote, they can be secure that their vote will be counted, guaranteeing that they can trust the integrity of the officials that will call the outcomes of elections. My epiphany of empathy has put me in the shoes for a few hours of those who've experienced disenfranchisement. And I've concluded that the only response to that has to be a concerted effort to protect voting and protect the democracy that relies upon it. I'll say this and conclude. January 6th will always be remembered as the attack on the Capitol. January 6th will always be the Feast of the Epiphany. January 6th was a day in our history of epiphanies. But what's the purpose of an epiphany? Is it just to kind of see things a new way? I think the purpose of an epiphany is to change your life, is to be surprised. Go and see something that you didn't expect, and then be willing to adjust your life and your priority as proof that you were paying attention. We'll be faced with a most significant decision in the coming days. Having been the 100 senators out of the 2,000 in history that have inhabited this chamber who were here during the attack, will we understand what happened, absorb that epiphany, and then act to protect people's rights to participate in this democracy? I pray that we will. I pray that we will. I yield the floor, Mr. President.
Mr. President,
Senator for New Jersey.
I stand here today with a sobered heart. I'm a big believer that if America hasn't broken your heart, you probably don't love her enough. We are here on the one-year anniversary of one of our great nation's moments of shame. We saw a violent attack on this Capitol, ignited and incited by demagogues who were trying to spread a lie, telling people their votes were stolen by a president who broke with our traditions of a peaceful transfer of power and told his supporters to come to this building. And on that day, that vicious attack, we saw heroic actions by men and women who stood in the breach to try to protect the 535 members of Congress, their staffs, the people in this body that do so much good to keep this nation's traditions moving. And as a result of that conflict, lives were lost. Brian Sicknick from my state died as a result of his injuries. And the feelings of that day are still with me. I was sitting right here next to friends and colleagues as we were told to stay in our seats, as we were told that the Capitol was under attack. I watched the basic decency of people in this room as staffers came in tears and in pain, and the comforting I saw of some of my colleagues, and watching other staff members protecting historic artifacts, protecting the very boxes that would ensure that our tradition would continue, that here on this earth a nation would be formed that values the highest ideals of humanity, that the people can come together and form amongst them a system of government. We were escorted out that door. And I think the gravity of it really hit me when we came right out that door, and one of the first things I saw was an officer down. I rushed over and said, "What happened?" And he said, I was hit. And then all along our retreat, in that ignominious moment, all along that retreat, we saw officers injured. I eventually walked and worked my way to my office. And I will never forget this moment as long as I live. I feel not just my own pain, but I thought immediately of my dad. And I felt the pain of my ancestors, because when I turned on that screen, the very first thing I saw was the Confederate flag. And it all came rushing to my heart. And I felt an ache and a hurt. My heart was broken. I know that day shocked a lot of people. But when I saw that flag, it connected to a current, the dark eddies of our nation's history that have been persistent, because violent mobs from the beginning of our country have tried to stop our democratic traditions. That flag in so many communities in this country, carried by Klansmen, carried by those who took democratically elected officials, blacks in southern states, ripped them from their offices, dragged judges into the street, beat them, lynched them. That was their flag. And as I watched from my office, I saw swastikas. I saw Muslim hate. I talked to black officers here. And as they defended the country they loved, they were repeatedly called the N-word over and over again. You can't be surprised. You just can't. As we have always, in every generation, tried to make a more perfect union, this is part of that story of people who want to stop the march of democracy. You think that the suffrage movement didn't face violence? It did. As people tried to intimidate and beat and stop the equal franchise. You think the civil rights movement didn't face violence? How many martyrs' names do we know? People who were shot down and killed because they did not want them to have equal representation. Why did I ache for my ancestors? Because those were the stories of my grandparents. Those were the stories of my father, of the fear and the intimidation of just trying to exercise your franchise. Why are we surprised by demagoguery and hate in our nation? It is a part of our story, but the greatness of our country is not that that existed, but the good people who have come together in every generation and said, not on our watch, we are better than this. We will pull together out of the great, vast diversity of our nation a rainbow coalition of people dedicated not to a race or a religion, but to a national ideal. I am here as a senator, just the fourth black person ever elected popularly in our nation's history. I am here because white folks and black folks and Asian folks and all Americans didn't just hope for a better democracy, didn't just condemn violence. They worked to preserve and protect and advance our nation. And what are we doing now? Is this going to be a day where we just condemn what happened? Is this just going to be a day where we point fingers of blame and feel good in our contempt for those who are at the core of that? If that's what this day is about, it is for naught. Because we fail then to recognize this is not about a day. This was not one day. It was not one moment. It is a part of our story. And the threads continue. How can we be blind to the violence that continues since that day? Threats on federal judges. We had a federal judge's family shot and killed in my state. They're up 300-400%. threats on members of this body, threats on all 535 Congresspeople are up around twofold. You think this is about a day when election officials, nonpartisan people all across this country now are seeing threats? Reuters documented more than 850 threatening, hostile messages aimed at election officials. In Philadelphia, a Republican who dared to tell the truth about the election, mirroring the words of then President Donald Trump's highest officials that the election was fair. What happened to him? Threats and intimidations, people calling his home, literally threatening to murder his 3 children. You think this is about one day in time? A survey from the Brennan Center for Justice in April of 2021 found that 1 in 3 U.S. American election officials feel unsafe because of their job, and about 20% listed threats to their lives as a job-related concern. This is not a foreign country. This is the United States of America, and our election officials, nonpartisan individuals, Republican, Democrat, fellow Americans are afraid to do their job because they tell the truth. This is not about one day. This is a story from the founding of our country as our founders tried to break with the course of human events and establish here the greatest experiment of humanity. There were people who wanted authoritarianism. There were people that wanted bigotry. There were people that wanted to protect with violence the kind of despotism that we broke away from. We make a big mistake if on this day we just talk about what happened here. We have protection. We have security. But all across this country right now, there are believers in this democracy that have the same fear that my grandparents did, the same fear that my father did, the same fear that blacks and whites who joined arms to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge for voting rights did. This is a cancer. It has always been here. And we make a tragic mistake just by talking about this day. Because when I survey the United States of America, I am so worried. There has never been a time in my life where I've been more worried about this democracy. I grew up with stories of family members who talked about the preciousness of what it is to vote. They loved the heroes of John F. Kennedy and Medgar Evers and these people who fought for them from all backgrounds. My parents taught me to love people, Jewish people who, like Abraham Joshua Heschel and Joachim Prince, people who knew that in America, if you just fight for your own rights, who are you? This is a nation where we know we're all in this. But I stand here today to tell you, why aren't we talking about the fact that in states right now, laws are being passed specifically designed to disenfranchise people? Don't take my word for it. The year I came to this body, in 2013, a federal judge in North Carolina looked at that voting law and said it was designed with surgical-like precision to disenfranchise black Americans. But I don't need to go back to 2013 to see reason for us all to be concerned. When early voting started in the fall of 2020 in Georgia, some voters had to wait up to 10 hours to vote in 6 metro areas in Georgia County, 6 metro areas, at polling places where minorities constituted more than 90% of active registered voters, the average wait time in the evening for those black communities was 51 minutes. When whites comprised 90%, in those communities, the average wait time was 6 minutes. Think about this for a second. Are we satisfied with a democracy that in some communities says the black communities will have to wait 8 times longer to vote? Is that what we mean, equal justice under the law? Is that what we mean when we look at our flag and say liberty and justice for all? There are states right now passing voting laws to make it harder to vote. And what happens when a working mom with 3 kids shows up and the line is an hour late or 2 hours late? What does she do? Is it fair to her? And then they go as far in Georgia to say that person that does want to wait, that brings a folding chair and sits there for 2 and 3 and 4 hours, they make it illegal for that person who might have diabetes, illegal for that person that might have a medical condition, for someone to bring them water? I'm sorry, I grew up, and I confess it on the Senate floor, with the naive belief that the stories of my father, the stories of my grandparents were history. That we wouldn't live in a country where black people are waiting 8, 9 times the weight of white people. That in some communities the wait would be 5, 6, 7 hours, a day's work in families that can't afford to give up a day's work. You think this was about a day? I tell you it's about the cancer in our democracy that has been here from its start. This country's very survival has to be faced every generation. Democracy is not certain, it is not automatic. Democracy is hard. Democracy takes work. Democracy takes sacrifice. But as we sit here now, in dozens of states, laws are being passed that disproportionately impact the disabled, that disproportionately impact Native Americans, that disproportionately impact people of color. And so when I go back to the Confederate flag I saw waving just feet from where we stand right now, a flag that got so much currency during the black backlash after Reconstruction, that got so much currency during the backlash after Brown v. Board of Education. I know it is part of a larger problem that none of us who love our nation and love this democracy can ever rest. There's 2 people I want to mention before I conclude. Both men I've come to admire. Both men risked their lives for this country. They weren't like our great, great veterans who fought nobly, and many of them died. But I hope we don't cheapen the truth of their story, because they did the work here at home, evidencing our highest values. When our founders wrote in the Declaration of Independence, we must mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Both of these men happen to be black, but it's a value that's evident in all backgrounds, in all people. I'm here because of that truth. Both of them were riddled with hateful words, called the N-word over and over and over again. One of those men I had the privilege of serving with, both of these men were violently attacked. Well, John Lewis was violently attacked as he tried to advance this democracy. He was beaten, had his head cracked open on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, spit in at sit-ins, and he won battles with others, and he came to Congress, and he worked and fought and defended, and Republicans and Democrats supported the voting rights bill. But then it was gutted by the Supreme Court. And may you all have the experience I have where your heroes become your friends. And I would ask him, how did it feel to watch part of his life work be torn apart and have these new voting laws that disproportionately impact African Americans? How did it feel? And John Lewis, this man of peace and this man of grace, just says to me, you cannot stop the work of this democracy. One generation's gains don't pass on like an inheritance to the next. They have to earn them. Well, the other person is a guy named Harry Dunn. Like John Lewis, he put his life on the line defending this Capitol. He's a Capitol police officer. And when I read and saw his interviews, after battling to save our lives against a mob incited by a demagogic president, he is sitting under the rotunda and turns to another person after being called the N-word over and over again and says simply, "Is this America?" I hope all of us see that we have a responsibility to answer that question. The John Lewis Voting Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, will be part of the answer to that question. Whether a little black boy and a little black girl and a little white girl and a little white boy who go to vote with their parents can see an equal voting opportunity, that is going to be an answer to that question. Every generation has got to make this country live up to its promise. We are losing ground, and it didn't start on January 6th of last year. I end with an answer, an inadequate answer to Officer Dunn. In a poem I learned from my parents, in a poem I shared an affection for with John Lewis, that calls upon every American not to point fingers of blame to others, but accept a responsibility, not just to be satisfied in your contempt for some, but rise up as a force of light and love for all. I end with Langston Hughes' poem, "Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, but yet must be, the land where everyone is free, the poor man, the Indian, the Negro, me. Who made America? Whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must make this mighty dream live again. Oh, yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to thank Senator Booker for his powerful, powerful statement. The whole country has to hear what you said. I want to thank Senator Kaine for your powerful words as well. It's just so important that people of your stature speak to our country and what we should be aspiring to do. So thank you for your leadership. Thank you to Senator Klobuchar for organizing this incredibly important moment on the first anniversary of the insurrection against the Capitol. 1 year ago, my colleagues and I started the day in this chamber ready to ratify the Electoral College votes and declare Joe Biden the next president of the United States. Instead, members of Congress were forced to take shelter under their desks and under gallery benches, place gas masks over their heads, pray that they would make it home to their families that day. Our staffs, journalists, Capitol workers wondered if they would live through the day, and their views of their workplace changed forever. Instead of a day celebrating the workings of our democracy, our nation was met with anti-democratic, white supremacist forces storming their way inside this building, violently attempting to overturn the results of the 2020 election. It was an insurrection. 1 year ago, the people's houses changed. But even though the ratification process, which recognizes the will of the American people, was interrupted, it was not defeated. On the night of January 6, 2021, as members of Congress returned to the chamber to ratify the results of the election of 2020, our democracy prevailed. But we thank the Capitol Police. We thank them for what they did that day. Some lost their lives. Some were injured. Some still suffer from the traumatic impact of what they had to do in order to protect these chambers, in order to protect the Electoral College votes that were in the well of this chamber. The whole country has a debt of obligation to those police officers and what they did to stand here and to protect all of us, the staff, the members, the parliamentarians, but to, more importantly, protect democracy. Because we were able to return here after 8 p.m. that night in order to cast those votes. And we owe a great debt of gratitude to those police officers who sacrificed so much on that day. But tragically, former President Donald Trump's big lie has turned into the big threat to our democracy. The insurrectionists were unsuccessful in overturning election results, but the death, injury, and breach of national security they caused must be held to account. And I want to thank the House of Representatives Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack for their commitment to that ongoing mission, as well as the hard-working men and women of the Department of Justice who have already brought charges against more than 725 individuals for their involvement in the insurrection. Donald Trump does lie, but the video, text, and messages from January 6th do not lie. We all saw what happened that day. And anyone who orchestrated, abetted, or participated in the January 6th attack must be held accountable. That includes those at the very highest level of our government. It means, as Attorney General Merrick Garland said yesterday, following the facts wherever they may lead. And if the facts lead to Donald Trump's criminal responsibility for the insurrection, then he should face the same consequences as anyone else, even if it means the only place he'll be in 2024 is in jail. But even as we now reflect on this day 1 year later, we must understand that investigation and prosecution alone will not prevent another attack on our democracy. This problem is larger than any one person or candidate or election cycle. We cannot forget the role that online platforms played during the lead up to the insurrection. Make no mistake, social media platforms have become hotbeds of disinformation, hate speech, and dangerous conspiracy theories. Today, the seeds of offline harms are planted, grown, and spread online. In the days before insurrectionists attacked the building, social media platforms, black boxes, algorithms promoted election misinformation and political groups that spread Trump's big lie. We need to open the hood to the online systems that are pushing toxic content to the public and feeding dangerous social movements online. But the January 6th mob was fueled not only by the big lie, but the global rise of authoritarian and nationalist movements that reject the basic principles of American democracy, equality, freedom, and the peaceful transfer of power. The attack on the Capitol revealed the growing fragility in our democratic processes and institutions, a systemic weakness caused by years of falsehoods and policies meant to undermine our right to vote in free and fair elections. It is unbearable to think that a big part of America no longer believes in any kind of democracy. They no longer believe in the rules that we all live by, in the pursuit of goodness and fairness and progress. Donald Trump is gone from the White House, but we know that the hate and division that defined his corrupt tenure has been with us since our founding. So many were willing to believe lies about the legitimacy of President Biden's victory because they had lost faith in the integrity of our democratic system. Some were even willing to engage in horrific violence because they believed elections could be stolen. The architects of the January 6th authoritarians, white nationalists, and those who stand to benefit from the continued undermining of our democracy want us to feel this way. For years, the dangerous coalition has worked to limit access to the ballot box, undermine fair voting districts, continuously spread disinformation about voter fraud. And in the wake of their attack on the Capitol, they now have accelerated their efforts. In 2021 alone, 19 states have passed 34 laws restricting the access to voting, continuing the assault on our electoral system. These efforts have eroded Americans' faith that they can actually choose their own elected representatives, sabotaged public trust in electoral outcomes, and disenfranchised countless voters, especially communities of color, indigenous people, the poor, young Americans, and individuals with disabilities. The big lie is that the election was stolen from Donald Trump in 2020. It was not. The big truth is that Donald Trump and his allies have put in place a process to steal the election of 2022 and 2024. That is the big truth of what is going on in this country right now. And the way they're going to accomplish that big truth is by having state after state in the United States pass laws which restrict the access to vote for black and brown and indigenous and poor and disabled Americans. That is the big truth about what is going on in our country right now. A systematic plan to steal the election of 2022, to steal the presidency in 2024. And the Republican Party has become a wholly owned subsidiary of Donald Trump on the issue of voter suppression, on the issue of making it impossible for this body for the United States Congress to pass laws which protect the rights of every American to vote. But we do have a chance right now on the Senate floor to stand up to this anti-democratic movement and to banish these discriminatory policies and put them in the political dustbin of history. The Senate can and must take action to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. And we must abolish the filibuster. If just for this issue, to protect the right to vote for every person in our country. And with these bills, if we modify the filibuster, American voices will no longer be drowned out by special interests, by redistricting that keeps black and brown communities marginalized, and by voting laws that are reminiscent of poll taxes and literacy tests that were used for centuries to stop black voters, minority voters, from participating in our democracy. We need expanded early and mail-in voting. We need automatic and same-day voter registration. We need to make Election Day a national holiday. We need to get rid of hours-long voting lines. We need to ban partisan gerrymandering. We need to get dark money out of our elections. We need to end the discriminatory voting laws that restrict access to the ballot box on the basis of race and age and income and more. We now have the opportunity to make sure that every voice is heard in our democracy. The 85-year-old black woman in Georgia who has waited hours to cast her ballot without even a bottle of water. The newly naturalized family in Arizona who took the bus 45 minutes to the closest voting location, energized by the chance to fully participate in American democracy. The mother of 4 in Massachusetts who works 2 jobs just to make ends meet and desperately needs that mail-in ballot. These are the voices that the ugly mob of hate and violence and division that attacked the Capitol on January 6th do not want to be heard in American politics in 2022 in the United States of America. But will we stand up? We have to ensure that at our moment in American history, that there's enough evidence to convict us of having stood up for democracy, of having fought for all of those who will otherwise be disenfranchised. This year, 2022, in the United States of America. Otherwise, we will have been found wanting in preserving the foundations of our democracy. That we will have fixed this broken system of government that is being dismantled by Republicans across this country, state after state, with Republicans here in Washington unwilling to cast a single vote. Not one Republican willing to stand up and say, we must pass laws to protect against what's happening in state after state to suppress the votes of black and brown and disabled and poor and indigenous Americans. With the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, we will not only guarantee that all Americans can exercise their right to vote in free and fair elections, we can also counter the distrust and the disenchantment that the insurrectionists exploited on January 6th. These reforms can restore Americans' faith in the peaceful transfer of power and prevent another attempt at insurrection by ensuring we have a government that is truly of, by, and for the American people. 1 year after the attack on the Capitol, we understand how fragile our democracy is and that the fight to protect it requires vigilance and clear-eyed determination. The very least we can offer the American people, all American people, on this day is our commitment to protect their right to vote. Former Attorney General Ramsey Clark, who helped draft the original Voting Rights Act in 1965, once said, "A right is not what someone gives you, it's what no one can take from you." Let us pass this historic legislation so that no one can take the fundamental right to vote away from those who rightfully have it today. The job of building and protecting a healthy and strong democracy is the sacred duty of this institution. The fate of the United States depends on us doing our jobs. May this day, January 6th, always remind us that we must never give up that fight. And here in 2022, let us win this fight on the floor of the United States Senate to protect the right to vote for every American, regardless of the state they live in, regardless of their color, their religion, their country of origin. That is our historic responsibility. God help the Senate if it does not respond to this historic challenge. I yield back, Mr. President.
President,
The senator from Oregon is recognized.
before he leaves, I want to thank my colleague from Massachusetts. We have worked often together on these democracy issues, and I look forward to doing that in the days ahead. I also want to commend Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota, because she has been our point person on the Rules Committee, which is central to this whole debate. I think we all understand what's at stake. That's what my colleagues have been outlining, and I think we have been very fortunate to have Senator Klobuchar at the helm, and she and I have worked together on one of the issues I'm going to talk about, vote by mail, but I just want people to understand how valuable she has been. Mr. President and colleagues, a year ago today, not far from where we stand this afternoon, domestic terrorists tried to beat our democracy to the ground. They might have been successful were it not for the police officers who defended our democracy as they were viciously attacked and beaten. Before anything else is said, in my view, by an elected official, we need to salute these officers and all those who work day in and day out alongside them here in the Capitol. For their courage, we ought to be eternally grateful. The insurrection on January 6th was instigated by the former president who wanted to undo the results of a democratic election. Let's also understand that unfortunately, inciting the mob wasn't the end of it. Donald Trump didn't exactly walk quietly off into the sunset after the Biden inauguration. The effort to undermine our democracy, to end free and fair elections in America, goes on as we speak. Support for the big lie is essentially unchanged from where it was a year ago. And an awful lot of Republicans who said after January 6th that they were done with the former president have cozied back up to him just 12 months later. The only reason the mob is not here today is Donald Trump didn't summon them back. Now, in my view, it's our job to ensure that another attack like this, or by any other means, never succeeds. And we'll have more to say about those issues in the days ahead. In my view, protecting the vote has got to be step one in protecting democracy. A guiding principle for the Senate must be that while politics may guide a citizen's vote, it should never determine whether they are allowed to vote. To act otherwise would undermine the very foundations of a representative democracy. Empowering voters with a system built on integrity and accountability, a system that promotes participation rather than discourages it, a system with a real history of bipartisanship. Mr. President and colleagues, that's the kind we have in my home state of Oregon. Oregon believes so strongly in the right to vote that everybody gets a ballot sent straight to their home. Mr. President, I'm honored to say that I was the first United States Senator elected in an all-vote-by-mail election. Back then, it was Oregon Republicans who were pushing to expand vote by mail. A Democratic governor even vetoed a vote by mail bill in 1995. Right after my election, the Oregon Republicans flipped back, and vote by mail was suddenly, oh, so bad. Now, everything flipped a few months later when my friend, Gordon Smith, a Republican from Eastern Oregon, became the second United States Senator to be elected by mail. At this point, Oregon voters said, we've just had it with everybody looking for some kind of partisan slant here. We just think vote by mail is a really terrific idea. And they went out to vote at a ballot measure, and they chose to make Oregon's elections all vote by mail, passing it with 70% of the vote in 1998. This, in my view, is the culmination of a process that started 40 years ago with some local elections in Lynn County, a small county in the western part of our state. It grew and grew from there. Election officials learned that when you let people vote at home, participation goes up and the costs go down. One of the biggest defenders of Oregon's vote at home system was the late Dennis Richardson. He was our Secretary of State, and by his characterization, he was about as conservative a Republican as you could get. But when the Trump era came along and people criticized our elections and said, oh, there's all this fraud, they were just spouting lies about it, Dennis Richardson, the late Dennis Richardson, stood up and said, I'm a conservative Republican. They're wrong. They're wrong in what they're saying about Oregon. And he even wrote to Donald Trump in 2017, and I quote, we're confident that voter fraud in last November's election didn't occur in Oregon. Every election now, Mr. President, young Oregonians watch their parents voting around their kitchen table. And it's a real inspiration to the next generation to make sure they're committed voters. Voting at home gives you the opportunity to be more informed. If there is a particular measure, an initiative, or a race that you haven't researched, you get time to look into the options. When you're done, your ballot goes into a security envelope, you sign the outside, and off it goes. For me, that's when I head from our home in southeast Portland, the Sellwood branch of the Multnomah County Public Library, drop my ballot in the collection box, and head home. No long lines, no glitchy touchscreen systems, just hassle-free voting. A recent analysis in the Election Law Journal said that of all 50 states, voting is easiest in Oregon. And Senator Klobuchar, I've heard colleagues go back and forth to say who's number one in participation and who's number one in all of these aspects. And I think, like a number of other states, we're all kind of competing for the highest turnout rates. We get some of the highest in the country. We've been a leader in terms of increasing turnout among Black and Latino voters. Voter registration is automatic. It's like as easy as a trip to the Department of Motor Vehicles. For myself, and Senator Klobuchar and I have talked about this so often over the years, I have been proposing legislation to have universal at-home voting since 2002. That's what my Vote at Home Act would do. It would give every American the right to vote the Oregon way, the vote that my neighbors and I can do. I will say here on the Senate floor, I guarantee that you do it the Oregon way, it will be a nationwide hit immediately. Letting people vote at home is also the best defense against some of the really horrendous methods of suppressing the vote. For example, what we've seen over the last few years, state and local governments shutting polling places, particularly ones that serve Black and Latino voters. What unforgivable actions. These days, in some areas, Republicans are making it illegal to give food and water to people standing in line to vote. Shouldn't be a test of physical stamina to be able to vote. Nobody should have to wonder if they'll be able to vote if they step out of line, go to a bathroom. Nobody should have to sacrifice an entire day to participate in this incredible democratic system that is America. That's why I proposed the People Over Long Lines Act, called the Poll Act. The bill says state governments have to guarantee that everybody who votes in person can do so within 30 minutes. Anybody who's forced to wait longer has a legal action they can bring. If they sue and win, it's $50 for waiting longer than 30 minutes, $50 more for every hour after that. A free bit of advice to states, get ready. Make sure people don't have to wait in lines. One of the best ways to make sure they don't have to wait in lines is to let them vote at home. It's not just Oregon, by the way, that votes by mail, and I think Senator Klobuchar, we heard some of our colleagues talk about their states and voting by mail. If you need another example, let's think about the United States Armed Forces. Most service members and their families vote by mail in every election. All of the people who wear the uniform in the United States can vote by mail in every federal election. Been that way for decades. So, the bottom line is that we think it's time to get the Oregon system into every nook and cranny in America. We feel that way because it works. It raises voter participation, lowers the cost of running elections, helps voters be more informed, safe and secure. And if you're resisting safe and efficient elections with higher voter turnout, then you're suppressing democracy in America. My home state of Oregon shows the way to preserve America. Mr. President, I'm going to close my remarks. I think we'll have Senator Klobuchar speak for all of us here in a moment. But in my closing, I want to touch just for a moment on my family that I'm so proud of. My German family fled their homeland, a place where they were deeply rooted in that nation's society, as my grandfather was a member of parliament and served on the Berlin City Council. My family was forced as Jews to flee the fascists who had taken over their democracy. They fled to America as the last remaining beacon of freedom. With that freedom, my dad chose to serve in our army that fought against German fascism. And my dad's been recognized for his unique contributions. We were so thrilled, for example, to have the senators from Maryland talk about the Ritchie boys. My dad was one of the Ritchie boys, a German kid who taught himself English so he could be out there fighting the Nazis. And I remember the good work of the senators from Maryland and how thrilled our family was about that. So my dad was about the greatest patriot around. He felt he was so lucky to be an American, to be in our army, to stand up for American values. And my final remark here today, Mr. President, is about my dad. If my dad was alive today, he would tell us, senators, make sure that the light in America's beacon of freedom never goes out. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you to the Senator from Oregon. We have had a day of tributes to those that work in the Capitol, those that protected us. We have had a day of reflection, and we have had a day of hope as we look to the future for our democracy that we hold with such care. I want to thank the staff that was there that day. And for those of you, I'm looking at the pages, who are new in the Senate, over the next few weeks, it's worth talking to one of the staff members who was here that day to hear their stories, to let them reflect on what happened to them, whether they were people who were assigned to the hallways or the trams or the cafeteria, what happened to them that day. The sergeant at arms, so many employees there that were here that day because this was the day of the peaceful transition of power in this chamber and in the House. The parliamentarian's office, that was those that work there, that was one of the most difficult moments, to walk into their office late in the morning, 4 in the morning, Senator Blunt and myself, when this was all done, after we had done our work with Vice President Pence in the House, we walked around downstairs. It was eerily quiet. There was no one there. And you walk into the rooms and there was glass, people's personal photos in the parliamentarian's office that were cracked, things thrown on the floor, their personal belongings. And you wonder, why'd they go in that office? Was it just a fluke? No. They actually understood where that office was. We later found out they knew exactly that that office was in charge of these electoral ballots and in charge that day of the proceedings and had a special place in our democracy. And they actually knew where that office was and deliberately went into that office and invaded that office. Everyone from the Capitol physicians to the floor staff, so both Democratic and Republican floor staffs that were here that day, charged with making this day move like it had over and over and over again every 4 years, when no matter who wins, we go and we do our work that is demanded of us under the Constitution. I remember 4 years before that, my candidate certainly didn't win in 2016, but we went and we did our job. And I remember at the time, Vice President Biden was presiding over that proceeding because it was the end of his time as vice president, just like Vice President Pence was involved this last time, and he did his job. I think about what the senators have talked about today, and we've heard from so many of our colleagues, Senator Warner and Van Hollen and Kane, talking about the National Guards of Virginia and Maryland and their police that came in not planned that this was going to happen this day and came in and helped protect the Capitol, and along with National Guards throughout our country, including from my own state of Minnesota, then stayed on for weeks and weeks and months until we could get the security and order in this place. The Capitol Police and so many of my colleagues, including Senator Booker, have shared the stories of the Capitol Police that day. And I know we've used some examples, some famous examples of those officers, but I think it's really important to note that every officer did something that mattered that day, some act of heroic duty by doing their jobs. We thank the work that has been done by the staffs of our Rules Committee who are here today, of Senator Blunt and my staff, as well as Homeland Security with Senator Peters and Portman, who immediately took on the task of holding very public hearings about what went wrong on the security side, and then the decisions to hire new leaders for our Sergeant-at-Arms with Senator Schumer's work on that, as well as the police chief with Chief Manger, who testified at length yesterday in a very bipartisan hearing, actually, in the Rules Committee about the changes that have been made, the changes when it comes to equipment, as we may remember that only 75% of the officers that day were in plain clothes. Only 25% had riot gear. The horrifying image of the riot gear locked onto a bus that no one could access while the Capitol was being invaded. The lack of a plan, in the words of the police officer broadcast on the police radio, does anyone have a plan? Does anyone have a plan? And sadly, the answer was literally no. That has now changed, as the chief has told us, when events have happened in the last few months in the Capitol, plans in place, operational plans, drills that have been conducted in this Capitol. The lack of resources, which had been demanded in the past, that Senator Leahy and the Appropriations Committee and Senator Shelby have come to the fore and have worked to get them the resources that they need. But the challenges that still remain with the vacancies on the police force, people working double shifts and overtime, and people not being able to take their vacation and be with their families because they're still working to protect our Capitol, and the police chief's pledge to work to recruit 200 or so more officers in just the next year with retention benefits and all the work that's being done. The other piece of this that we heard a lot about today was accountability. We heard from Senator Durbin and members of the Judiciary Committee and Senator Booker about the need, and Senator Markey, for accountability. And this includes the Select Committee over in the House and the investigation that they're conducting with not just Democrats, but also two very strong Republicans who have been willing to basically put their careers on the line because they believe so much in this democracy that we must get to the bottom of what happened. The work going on in the Justice Department, which has now been, as of yesterday, as the Attorney General of the United States described to us, is the biggest investigation in the history of America. Because I don't think people had envisioned that we would have an attack like this, but we did. 244 years of democracy. 244 years of democracy that it is our charge to protect. And that is why you see this investigation. That's why you see over 700 people charged. This is why you see the Attorney General pledged to follow this to every level and to follow the facts to where they go. And we must remember in the end, as my colleague from Oregon, Senator Wyden, has addressed, this is not just and was not just an attack on a building. It was an attack on our republic. I was looking back at the inauguration day and that beautiful moment with that blue sky, and there were little snowflakes coming down. And I remember hearing the beautiful words of Amanda Gorman in her gold coat that day with that amazing poem. The singing, I remember Garth Brooks singing Amazing Grace, and I looked up at the sky and thought anything and everything is possible, and our democracy has prevailed. And I remember the words of Abraham Lincoln, actually, which I quoted in my brief speech that day when he gave his first inaugural address in front of this Capitol, and the dome was only partially constructed. It was braced by ropes of steel back then, and he promised he would finish it. And he was actually criticized for spending funds during the Civil War on the dome, as it was somehow frivolous. And to those critics, he replied, "If the people see the Capitol going on, it is a sign we intend the Union shall go on." Well, when we gathered that day on that inaugural stage, There was still spray paint on the columns. They actually couldn't get it all out because the insurrectionists had first come to that platform, because just as they knew what was going on in the parliamentarian's office, they targeted that platform because that is exactly where President Biden and Vice President Harris were going to receive their oaths of office. And there was still traces of the spray paint. The windows behind us weren't the real windows. They were makeshift windows. But we all gathered there. The president-elect, now president, would not have his inauguration in a bunker. And Senator Blunt and I strongly believe that this should be a public event. And as we stood out there, the Capitol shall go on. That was the message we were sending to the country. So what does that mean right now, a year later, year of this anniversary, the Capitol shall go on? Yes, it means that we have better security and we do better by our police officers and we have their backs. It means that. And we do better by the staff in this great building. And yes, it means we have accountability for the people that had the audacity to invade this Capitol and take the law into their own hands and commit acts of violence. But the other thing it has to mean a year later is that we carry on that torch of our democracy, as the senator from Oregon explained, that we make sure that our very democracy is protected. And that means guaranteeing that people have the right to vote. And what was not accomplished that day with the bear spray and the bayonets and the flagpoles is sadly carried on, because these bills that have been introduced and in so many states passed across the country, over 400 of them passed in many, many states across the country, or proposed, seriously proposed in others, brings us backwards. And it basically says, you know what? Democracy, the people that propose these bills, is not about who votes for who, regardless of who wins. It's about us choosing our voters and deciding have and have-nots, and who's going to be able to vote and who isn't going to be able to vote. And when you think about what the people of this country will do to preserve that right to vote, I think about those people in Wisconsin with homemade masks and garbage bags standing in the pouring rain at the beginning of the pandemic just to exercise their right to vote. I think about the veteran that I met when we did our field hearing with Senators Warnock and Ossoff and Senator Merkley and Padilla down in Atlanta, when this veteran told us that he had signed up to serve our country and there wasn't a waiting line. But when he went to exercise his right to vote, he had to wait hours and hours, 4 or 5 hours in line in the hot sun just to exercise his right to vote. And he told the stories of older people that had left because they couldn't stand the heat, that they couldn't stand out there anymore. That's not what our democracy is supposed to look like. It's not supposed to look like one ballot box in the entire county of Harris County, which includes Houston, in Texas, over 5 million people with one ballot drop-off box. That's not our democracy. But the American people in that 2020 election, they said, you know what? No matter what you do to us, we're going to go vote. And they voted in droves, and they voted more votes than in the history of America. And part of that was because of the pandemic, changes were made to the laws, including some states took away ridiculous requirements that you have to get a notary public. Think about it, in the middle of a pandemic. And right now, by the way, South Carolina has put this law back in effect. To get your mail-in ballot, because you can't go vote in person because you got COVID, you have to have a notary public. And there are stories reported in the news of people having notary publics through the glass windows of hospitals sign off on the application of their ballots. All of that is designed, in the words of Reverend Warnock, so that some people don't allow some people to vote. That's what that's about. So it is on us right now to carry on the democracy. And that feeling we had when the leaders of both parties all stood on that inaugural stage, or when we took that last walk, Senator Blunt and Vice President Pence and I, and the two young women with the mahogany box with the last of the electoral ballots, that feeling was a good one. And it was a celebration of joy for our country and the peaceful transition of power. And as pointed out in our speeches on the Senate floor right after the insurrection, I remember Senator Shaheen standing right there talking about how the world is watching at our democracy. Well, this is another moment. The world is watching as we see dictators coming into power in other countries around the world, as we see the former president still out there rallying the troops around this big lie that he somehow won the election when every single local election official in this country knows that's not true. This is our moment to stand up to that, because the people are watching, our kids are watching, and their democracy stands in the breach. This is our moment. We must pass the Freedom to Vote Act, and we must uphold our democracy. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
President,
The senator from Nevada is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 485 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 485, relating to the death of the Honorable Harry Mason Reed, Jr., former senator for the state of Nevada.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered and made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 12 noon Friday, January 7th, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed, that upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Bose nomination.
Without objection.
If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order, under the provisions of Senate Resolution 485.
Under the previous order and pursuant to S. Res. 485, the Senate stands adjourned until 12 noon on Friday, January 7th, 2022, and does so as a further mark of respect to the late Harry Mason Reed, Jr., former senator from Nevada.